social media comes with the ability to increasingly fact-check our government sources and media sources, but it also comes with just more voices and conspiracy theories. And, are conspiracy theories good to entertain? Possibly. How do we know if they are true or not? Are we getting smarter or dumber? And how do we keep up with all of this? At what point do we go too far from one end of the spectrum where we just believe everything that authorities tell us to the other side of the spectrum and believing whatever conspiracy theory just affirms our own biases or what we want to believe to be true? That's what we're going to be talking about today here on the Biblical Anarchy Podcast.
If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hey everybody, I'm Jacob Winograd. I'm the host of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, which is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, part of our Christians for Liberty network. Find out more about my podcast at biblicalanarchypodcast.com. Follow me at Biblical Anarchy, and of course, check out christiansforliberty.net to see the rest of the shows that we have here at LCI. So recently, there was a much too short, like a criminally short debate between Dave Smith and Seth Dillon of the Babylon Bee. Dave is a friend of mine. He's the host of the Part of the Problem podcast. He's a libertarian and someone who I'd say roughly agree with on most of the issues. And they had a conversation about Nick Fuentes and the conversation he had with Tucker Carlson about the Israel issue and the ceasefire in Gaza. And it was on the Piers Morgan show, and Piers framed it in terms of just like, how do we understand what is true? How do we fact check our sources? How do we just keep up with just the 24-hour news cycle? How do things like AI and deepfakes and conspiracy theories, how do we evaluate all this? And Seth was an interesting person for Dave to spar on these subjects with, because Seth is a Christian, a conservative, and the Babylon Bee creates a lot of content, which I think, is, generally on the sort of like cultural side of things that I would agree with, but not when it comes to perhaps foreign policy, and perhaps especially not when it comes to recently the war between Israel and Hamas and the treatment of the Palestinians in Gaza. I haven't seen as much from Seth on this subject. I think one of his partners over there, Joel Berry, though, his commentary has been something that I've been especially aggravated by. I think at one point he basically said that there were no real Christians in Gaza, even though there's been thousands of Christians who lived in Gaza, and basically just saying anyone who's a Palestinian is a terrorist, and just very un-Christian ways of talking about this conflict. And just regardless of where you come from it, like you could be pro-Israel defending itself, and even think that the way Israel defended itself was necessary, but you still don't have to sort of buy into these just very anti-Christian, very collectivist, collective guilt tropes that like there's no such thing as an innocent Palestinian and that all Palestinians are terrorists. And it just doesn't sit right with me at all. But they had this conversation. They touched on a lot of things, and there was just a lot that I wanted to react to. And again, it was like a 40-minute debate, not even. And again, I just felt like they just scratched the surface on a lot of these subjects. And so I thought I would play as much as I can and react to it, kind of see where we go. So I'm going ahead and bring that up here, and we'll start playing it.
But that's the point, isn't it, Seth Dillon, is that people are finding it increasingly hard to know what to believe. I don't disagree with Dave's assessment that social media in particular, and look, people like us who do our own thing now, that you can hold everything to proper account, you can debate this freely, you can reveal where corporate and government and media, mainstream media narratives have been clearly demonstrably wrong. That is all true. But it does feel like, particularly with AI, with deepfakes and all this kind of thing, that in sophisticated hands, the ability to completely con people now in a very convincing way is becoming much easier and more dangerous.
Yeah, well, I agree with what both you just said and what Dave said, that, obviously there's been conspiracy theories that came true. There's been things that were conspiracy theories that were presented as truth. There's a lot of distrust, and a lot of distrust is well-founded. It's rooted in something. It's rooted in something real. One of the reasons I've been such a strong proponent of free speech is so that we actually have the freedom to push back on false narratives, things that we shouldn't believe, things that aren't true, things that aren't well-founded. We need the freedom to actually hash these things out and have a conversation, have a debate about them. I think debate is the best way to get to the truth.
So it's interesting that Seth says all that, because I agree with pretty much everything he said there. And he said he agreed with what Dave said earlier, which I didn't play that part, but kind of around the same thing, that like the last 5 years, I'd argue the last 20 years, you could say the last 50 years, I just think people, even if you're what we might call a normie or a moderate, even if you're like listening to this and you're not a libertarian and you kind of feel like conspiracy theories are kooky and you generally think we can trust the government, you have to admit that there are at least certain instances in the last 5 years and 10 years, 20 years, where we know the government lied to us, or at least got things very wrong. Like, just take something like the Iraq War, for instance. I mean, I don't know how you deal with something like the claim of weapons of mass destruction and don't come away with either the government was tragically wrong, like catastrophically wrong and incompetent, or that they were lying. And really, it's both. It's some people were lying, and other parts of government, the lower parts, the other public officials believed the lie and were incompetent, and so it's always a mixed bag. And yeah, so Seth Dillon is saying that like we have good reasons to be asking questions and mistrusting things, and that debate and free speech are the ways that we deal with this. And I would generally agree. It does seem to me like, as you'll see later on, that in terms of execution, it's a bit of a mixed bag from Seth's part and from a lot of conservatives. And, I don't know where I heard this recently, but someone said something along the lines of saying that libertarians are welcome in Republican and conservative spaces. And I don't think I really pushed back on that at the time, but I remember thinking, kind of, not really. I mean, like, compared to what? As a libertarian, if I walked into like a Democratic Socialist convention or even just a regular Democrat convention, even then it just depends on the issue, right? If I'm talking about taxes and if I'm talking about Christianity, then probably among Republicans, I'll get along fine. But if I'm talking about my views on ending the drug war and on foreign policy and criminal justice, then it just depends on the Democrat. There's probably some Democrats or progressives or those on the left who I would be very welcome with. I mean, I listen to like the Young Turks a lot, and I used to listen to them when I was on the left too. And it's funny. It's like until they start talking about economics, it's just like a lot of agreement with them when it comes to evaluating the corruption of government, it comes to evaluating foreign policy, when it comes to evaluating sort of mixed interests and, hidden agendas and corruption and government and kind of like this unholy alliance between governments and corporations at many instances. And so, yeah, anyway, Seth says that free speech and free dialogue are the way we win this out. And yet I just don't think on the particular topics that are going to be taking place here and then that have taken place elsewhere, I don't know that him and the Babylon Bee have really lived up to that. So anyway, let's keep playing here.
I do think, though, which, this may be a point where me and Dave disagree, maybe not, is that, a lot of people are exploiting the distrust to engage in a sort of kind of radical conspiracism where, it's not really, some conspiracies are more reasonable than others. Some are just attempts to try to find any dots that you can find that might possibly be connected in some way in order to vilify somebody that you don't like and reach some kind of predetermined conclusion. We're using a reasoning method that's kind of like the inverse of Occam's razor, where instead of like the simplest, most straightforward explanation is probably the best, we're going for, whatever's the most convoluted and hardest to falsify and that casts your enemies in the worst possible light. That's what we're going with as the truth. I think that's a very cynical play. I think it's very dishonest. And so there is a sense in which the conspiratorial stuff, which has some legitimacy to it in some cases, has been overdone and exploited.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. A good example, actually, is I had a bit of a falling out with Elon Musk a year or so ago about Alex Jones. And his initial position about Jones was that his deliberate defamation of the Sandy Hook families and the subsequent award of $1 billion against him, that his trampling on the graves of children, as Elon put it himself, disqualified him from having an active account on X because he would just continue to make hundreds of millions of dollars by pouring.
All right. So I'm probably going to skip ahead here, but I just think it's worth pointing out that, he said that like conspiracy theories go wrong when you're just connecting wild dots and not following some kind of trail of evidence. And I would agree with that. But what's frustrating is that oftentimes when we're trying to talk about evidence, there are different standards of evidence that people are operating by. And some people on right and left or even center are going to discount evidence based upon the source of the evidence. And this can create a sort of circular logic where like, well, I'm not going to trust that evidence or that source because they don't have the right government certifications or they don't have the right credentials and expertise. And, or it's a bias towards certain sources over others. And so evidence is good. No one's against evidence. And I don't even disagree with Seth when it comes to understanding that there is bad conspiracy theorizing where there's zero evidence and it's just wild speculation, right? I think that what helps this is delineating between speculation and certainty, and also between rejection of one narrative versus the embracing of alternative narratives. The way I would put it is that I don't have to have a fully evidenced, fully explained theory or alternative explanation for something to reject what we might call the official or mainstream narrative. So like when it comes to, let's say like something like 9/11, there are some questions about why the FBI didn't act on certain information that they had beforehand about the hijackers and the idea of a planned attack, which there had already been attacks on the Twin Towers in previous years. There's questions about, not that Israel did 9/11, but the information that Mossad had. And there's questions about what happened to Building 7 and, just the even particulars about how certain things got damaged and certain things didn't get damaged, to the point where there's like tons of conspiracy theories out there about 9/11, right? Same thing with like JFK. There's a lot of conspiracy theories out there because it just doesn't seem like, that it was just a random assassination and, how many Kennedys kept dying later on and just the timing of it all. There's conspiracy theories about the death of Charlie Kirk because, again, people don't really buy the official narrative. Text messages seem fake and contrived. There was conflicting reports about if he turned himself in or didn't turn himself in and if he was cooperating or not cooperating. Video evidence doesn't really work right. The weapon, the idea that Charlie's neck stopped a bullet that it could not have stopped. They're just, again, and then you go like, well, what do you think happened? It's like, I don't know. But it's not my job to know what I don't know. But I do have a responsibility and the ability to judge what you give me. And so I don't need to know what happened. But if you're going to try to tell me this happened, the burden on proof is on you to prove this happened. This version of events happened. If you can't prove it, you can't prove it. Right? No, I don't think there's anything wrong with then going, well, I don't know what happened. Here are some alternatives that I don't have evidence to back up, but that seem plausible. Right? And so, I guess I agree kind of with what Seth was saying there, but I also think that like it's not quite like it is following the evidence, but it's also understand. Like put it this way, there is legitimacy to pattern recognition. There is a legitimacy to understanding the incentive structures that certain people have. Like when you're evaluating Marco Rubio and his ideology and his even, origins, as someone from, has roots and connections in Latin America and with Cuba and with Venezuela, and then he's Secretary of State, and then you're evaluating why our government is doing certain things with the bombing of boats and the threatening of regime change in Venezuela. You go, yeah, I don't really buy this official narrative that it's just about the drug war, and there are some incentives at play here. It's not reckless conspirizing, I think. So anyway, I will cut to the next part here and keep playing.
Fuel onto the pain of his families. And almost every time he went on a tear.
That being said, there's really no question that the censorship of the previous Twitter regime was much, much worse than this one. And so on net, I think we've had more protection.
Specifically this conspiracy about what happened in the Hamptons with Charlie Kirk, and was he blackmailed, or was there all this money offered, and then when the money was turned down, he winds up dead. My name was brought up over and over and over again as being in the room and being part of those discussions and
being abused in the street. People were turning up at the graveside, urinating as it was. And to me, we're dangerous, mass murder, unfettered platform.
You look at the numbers, I'm not so sure it wasn't Nick Fuentes platforming Tucker. And I mean this with, I love Tucker, he's a good friend of mine. But look, the one that makes it particularly ridiculous with this Nick Fuentes thing, and I agree with you too, by the way, I've talked to all types of people. I've had conversations with communists on my show and socialists. Weirdly, that
platforming across anywhere that people... I mean, Dave, for you, what do you make of Tucker Carlson rightly say to people, hang on, you're giving a serial killer a platform. Why would you not let Nick Fuentes on? And it's an interesting question. So, I mean, Dave, for you...
So this next bit is going to jump a little bit ahead, and it's just going to be Dave and Seth talking about, again, this Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes conversation that happened. And it'll connect to the conspiracy theories and Israel and all that. So let me go ahead and bring that back up now.
What do you make of Tucker Carlson platforming Nick Fuentes? Should people like Nick Fuentes have free, unfettered platforming across anywhere that people want to have them? Should there be any limits to people in terms of giving them a platform?
Well, I mean, I think that's a decision for anybody to make of who they want to talk to. I mean, I believe in freedom of association. By the way, if you look at the numbers, I'm not so sure it wasn't Nick Fuentes platforming Tucker. And I mean this with, I love Tucker, he's a good friend of mine. But look, the one that makes it particularly ridiculous with this Nick Fuentes thing, and I agree with you too, by the way, I've talked to all types of people. I've had conversations with communists on my show and socialists. And weirdly, that never seems to be an issue, which is very strange in a way, because it's you could make an argument communism is the worst ideology ever. It's responsible for 100 million deaths in the 20th century. It's still responsible for the oppression of people in Cuba and in North Korea, maybe quasi in Venezuela. But with Nick Fuentes, particularly in this moment, what's so funny to me about it is guys, we ran the experiment of trying to censor Nick Fuentes. When I say we, I don't mean me. I never believed in that, and I had him on my podcast, back in the day too. But this guy is huge. It's just undeniable. He is huge. So at this point, you're just saying, would you like to not have a conversation about this? I think there are lots of bad ideas all over the place. I always err on the side of sitting down and having a conversation is better than putting people in silence, trying to squash people. And look, Nick Fuentes was one of the most censored people in the country, and he's bigger than ever right now. So clearly that didn't work. And now we're having conversations.
Yeah.
And Seth, if we simultaneously, you mentioned the Charlie Kirk thing, Seth. I wanted to ask you specifically.
Yeah. So, right there, I think there's an important point that Dave brings up, which is that And so when you squash the conversation, right, you don't have free speech around something, people then will have this incentive to think well, what are you hiding, right? And then they'll look more into it, and ideas can become more popular, and people can become more popular. And this is it explains a little bit what happened with Nick Fuentes. And, the conservative and liberal establishment, I think went after Nick more than anyone I can think of on record, in terms of they didn't just deplatform him, they almost tried to deperson him, right? Made it hard for him to have bank accounts and to travel and to own a home or to rent and to just be on the internet. And yet, despite all the obstacles, he continued to gain quite an audience, to the point where he's huge. Right? Like Dave said, Tucker had him on, and Tucker's numbers are high, but they were even higher when Fuentes was on. So, he's not getting, is he getting platformed by Tucker, or is it mutual platforming in a way? Does it convergence? Now, Nick Fuentes, if you don't know him, he's a very controversial young person, not as young as he used to be. He started when he was very young. He was 18 years old when he started doing political stuff online. And I think he's 26 now. He's not married, to my knowledge. He is a conservative, but he's not a traditional conservative. He calls himself America First. He's, it's there are things that I would describe as positions that I agree with, even if maybe for different reasons. He used to be a libertarian, actually, he said, but he's not an interventionist. He's America first. He's a Christian. He said he's a Catholic. So, like on certain social issues, we'd probably agree on paper. But in terms of why he's controversial, well, he's engaged in a lot of stuff that it's hard to even know what he believes and what he doesn't. And this isn't me defending him. It's actually a criticism. It's something I learned I had to be careful about when I started doing stuff, is that you can only do this kind of routine of like shock humor and being an edgelord online, and then saying really controversial things, really outrageous, nasty, borderline evil things. You can only do that so often and then like play the card, I was just joking, before people kind of go, I don't really know if you're joking. So he's engaged. So when I say there's a lot of stuff he's engaged in, it's like his crowd, his audience, and him himself would maybe affirm some of it as their legitimate views, and some of it they'd go, well, that's just like times where he's riffing and just being, edgy and trying to, own the libs and etc. Right? But he's engaged in, Holocaust denial. He's praised figures like Hitler. He's said things about women and marriage that, go beyond just traditional social conservative views and are kind of beyond the pale, in my opinion. And his views on race are also all over the place, because again, he'll say things, but then also be like, well, I don't believe in racial hatred or violence, and I want to live in a society with rights for all. So again, the problem with Nick is, like, even if you want to be charitable, is that it's duplicitous at best, right? And you don't know. It's hard to take him seriously on anything he says. So this is the importance of having integrity. And, like, I'm not if any his people were listening to me, I can anticipate their comments because I've seen them before. Listen, as an individual, as a person, comedy is subjective. I actually kind of enjoy dark humor, and I'll listen to comedians who have very raunchy, dark humor, be self-deprecating, even engage in racial humor and like making fun of different groups and whatnot, kind of leaning into stereotypes. And I think that there is something, it can be funny, and humor is subjective. So if you don't find it funny, that's fine. I think there can be something healthy to a little bit of like being able to laugh at yourself and also laugh at your identities, to like, laugh at certain jokes and that are made at the expense of men, that play on male, female stereotypes, and even on things like race, as a white person or even as a Jewish person. I mean, let me tell you, as a person who's ethnically Jewish, that there are, like, among Jewish people, we'll make jokes at our own expense, about Jewish stereotypes, with each other or with my with my friends who know I'm Jewish. They make that stuff, and it's ribbing each other. It's in good fun. It's so people know you don't take yourself too seriously, and you're not wound up too tight. I think that most people who kind of know what I'm talking about and know that there's like a healthy version of this that's normal. But like, you do that, either as like a comedian in a very clear pretense, in a very clear context, or you do that, in private. But when you kind of like build a following on that stuff, I think it can go way too far. It can be to the point where you don't have plausible deniability, and like, you're not just joking, or people can't tell. And if people can't tell, then they can't tell. So yeah, it's a major problem. I'm gonna end this. This will be part 1, and I will come back and record part 2 later. Hey everybody, I had to pause the recording where I ended up, and then I didn't get back to it for like a week and a half or so, 2 weeks. And so I have had a haircut since then. I'm obviously wearing different clothes. So like, it's a little weird, but sometimes that's just what happens when you're trying to record stuff. I've been going live a lot lately. So I guess I'll take this brief intermission just to, do some sort of plugging of different things going on, both with me and with LCI. Of course, I want you guys to keep in mind that there are other shows at LCI, and one of those shows is the LCI Green Room. And we've had just we've always done at least like one a week for the most part, but we've definitely been ramping that up and having bigger guests on. We've had James Lindsay on, we've had Dave Smith on, we've had some libertarian heavy hitters on, like Liquid Zulu and Dan Sanchez from FEE, and guys from the Mises Institute, like Jeff Degner. So a lot of great conversations, and there's even more scheduled throughout the end of the year. So I definitely want you guys to be subscribed to our YouTube channels and watch these things live. Or keep in mind, I'll have links for this in the description for both, if you're listening to the audio or the video, that a lot of these lives will get published on the audio feed for the Biblical Anarchy podcast, but not all of them. And we have a separate audio feed for these live streams. If you just don't prefer to listen to them live, you don't listen to things on YouTube, but you want to listen to these conversations that I don't put all of them on the Biblical Anarchy podcast feed. So there's a separate one for the LCI Green Room, and I haven't plugged that in a while. So I'm going to have a link for that in the description if you want to go see the catalog of conversations, many of which aren't on this podcast feed. Go check that out. And of course, if you watch on YouTube, then just make sure you're subscribed to get the notification bell. Follow me on X is the best place for and at Biblical Anarchy, and I'm usually and plus there's at LCI Official, and on both channels we are usually promoting these live streams as they are occurring. So I just wanted to take a second to explain why I've been doing plenty of podcasting. I just haven't been able to come back and record an episode, finish recording for my episode for my podcast. And of course, I've been on other people's shows as well. Like last week's episode, I played a segment from my appearance on Larry Sharp's show. Anyway, though, I do want to get back to playing. We're going to finish wrapping up talking about the conversation Dave had with Seth Dillon on the Piers Morgan show. At this point, it was a couple weeks. It was 2 weeks ago, so it's a little dated. But the Nick Fuentes in this conversation is not going away. So let me go ahead and share my screen again, and we'll keep listening kind of where we left off last time.
What Candace Owens has been doing around Charlie Kirk's murder. Many people think she is deliberately fueling pretty insane conspiracy theories linking Israel to the murder and so on. You've been dragged into some of this stuff, I know. What is your response to what Candace has been doing? Because she has a massive platform. She's getting these views amplified to a lot of people.
I think it's despicable in the same way that you think what Alex Jones was doing was despicable, for the same reason. You have people who are close friends and family members and associates, colleagues of Charlie Kirk, who loved him very dearly and are in the middle of mourning and grieving the loss of their friend, somebody that they love. And the spotlight of suspicion is being shined on them, and they're being accused of playing some kind of role in a cover-up. And you need to have, in order to leverage accusations like that, or even just insinuations, if you're not alleging it and you're just kind of like, here's the dots, you guys go connect them. You have to have some evidence. You have to have some reason for thinking that's the case, not just that you feel it. We know we don't know, but we know that we know, is something that she said. It's just, you can't go by your gut feelings. You can't go to what your dreams and what your dreams told you, and then go down this dark path of trying to vilify and smear people who had nothing but love for Charlie, and would have, some of them I know very personally. Frank Turek was there standing by Charlie's side. He's been caught up in some of this stuff, and he's been in the crosshairs of Candace just recently. And he would have put himself between that bullet and Charlie if he could have. He loved Charlie like a son. And so, the grief is compounded by all of this. But just a step back real quick to the thing about, Fuentes on Tucker's show. I agree with Dave.
I want to stop it right there just for a brief second, because on one hand, I appreciate what Seth is saying, that we have to be careful not to be driven by our feelings. And this can happen to anyone, regardless of your political ideology or your biases, right? Even religious biases can sometimes lead. Like I grew up in Pentecostal churches, and sometimes there was that tendency to kind of blame the devil on everything, right? And to be sure, spiritual warfare exists. I think the devil is real, but there's also a way of talking about these things where you're being overly conspiratorial, you're being overly generalized, you're not being specific, you're not following evidence, you're not using good discernment. And I think that when it comes to like this Charlie Kirk stuff, on one hand, I've been very reluctant to kind of feed into any of the conspiracy theories too much. And I've not even said what I think happened. But there's a difference between, using your emotions or your intuitions to definitively say what did happen versus having skepticism for what people are trying to tell you happened. So the same sort of, skepticism that Seth is using towards conspiracy theories, I have for the official narrative. And there are things about the official narrative given by the FBI, given by, I'm forgetting his name, the FBI director, it'll come to me in a minute, but they came out and had this conference and talked about how Kash Patel and talking about how they found the just everything about when you look into it, especially if you know guns and you look into the weapon that they said they used and how the shooter made the shot and how he escaped and then left the weapon there and then the text messages and just all that's just it doesn't pass the sniff test, and you're just kind of I'm highly skeptical that this is actually what happened. Even the ballistics of the bullet and how it hit Charlie's neck and that it didn't go through his neck and just it, the weird hand signals of the people who were behind Charlie. And so I don't know what happened. I don't pretend to know what happened. And there's some people who go from I don't know what happened to then, well, because and listen, as a libertarian, I think all governments have engaged in political assassinations of people they don't like. I think that about the American government. I think that about the Russian government. I think that about probably many Muslim countries and their governments. And I don't have any reason other than being worried about accusations of anti-Semitism to believe that the Israeli government and Mossad have not done this. And it's just an unfortunate part of all governments, I think, throughout history. But even in today, and it's maybe not something we talk about in public schools when you're going through civics class, but I think it is just reality, and declassified information has showed that our government has done these things throughout the decades. And so it's not that I can't believe governments of any, America, Israel, or anyone couldn't have done it, but there's also just no evidence that they did. So it's one thing to be like, well, this is possible, it's plausible. But to Seth's point, though, there is something, on the other hand, I think he's kind of leaving out, which is that Charlie was clearly conflicted about his feelings towards the nation of Israel, towards the government of Israel, and the influence of Jewish identity in politics, and the fact that he was having a lot of pressure from his Jewish friends and Jewish funders for pulling out funding for his events and trying to pressure him to not platform certain people and to not talk about certain things. And he very openly in conversations had talked about this. And then there were text messages in these private, text chats he had with different people where he was expressing, feeling like he was almost being forced to have to reconsider his position on the pro-Israel cause. And a lot of these people, including Seth, were basically lying and saying that this didn't happen. But then when the receipts came out, and that largely came from Candace Owens, and then his own people had to confirm, including people like Josh Hammer, had to confirm that, these were real, these were not fake. And so, put it this way, when there are people who think, well, maybe Israel had something to do with this, and then the prime minister of, I was adjusting my computer monitor there, when people like Benjamin Netanyahu come out the next day and they're like, we didn't do it. And then there's this, what seems like this huge virtue signal kind of campaign, people coming out being like, no, Charlie loved Israel. Charlie loved it. Charlie was never reconsidering his position on Israel. And then the evidence comes out that he was reconsidering his position on Israel. It looks bad, right? When you're caught lying, then you're going to feed the worst impulses and the worst suspicions of people when it comes into this stuff. And that's kind of the point of all this conspiracy theory things, is that when you lie, you are then Douglas Murray in his debate with Dave Smith said, be careful what you're watering, when Dave talks about the history of neoconservatism and loyalty to Israel in terms of decisions that have been made in American foreign policy. You pro-Israel types, you need to be careful what you're watering when you lie, when you cover things up, because then you fuel the conspiracy theorists. They go, see, pro-Israel crowd's lying. This is just one more data point in our long list of evidence of Jews and Zionists and pro-Israel people lying in order to further an agenda. And we do live, like one of the live streams I did recently was with James Lindsay. And I agree with, James is pro-Israel, by the way. So like, I'm willing to talk to people who are on the, and really, like, I'm not anti-Israel, but I'm critical of the Israeli government. On the Israeli-Gaza war, I have not been in favor of what Israel has done. I've not been in favor of how Israel has handled the Palestinian problem throughout their entire history. But I'm not anti-Israel in the same way I'm not anti-America when I criticize the American government. But for brevity's sake, people will put me in the anti-Israel crowd, and people will put James Lindsay in the pro-Israel crowd. But I talk to pro-Israel people all the time, not just on this podcast, but just in my life, people in my family, people I go to church with. And anyway, I had a conversation with James Lindsay, and we talked about the poison that is grievance-based identity politics, and that there is a problem of grievance-based identity politics rising up on not just the left, but it's been there for a while, but rising up on the right as this like reactionary thing. And I see the problem of that, and I don't want that to happen. Yet, if you allow people to lie and cover things up because of your ideology, because of your political commitments, then what you are watering is the grievance-based identity politics, because you're not having the conversation. You're not showing integrity. So I think for time's sake, I'm going to end this episode here in terms of at least covering things that Seth and Dave talked about. Despite it being short, there's just a lot to say on the subject. I do think I'm going to do, and I talked briefly about Nick Fuentes. I think I want to do my next episode, I want to do entirely talking about Nick Fuentes. I've talked about him in some live streams, and I've talked about him a little bit here, but Nick is a phenomenon. He's someone who I have a lot of disagreements with, and yet he's a person who I want to cover fairly, and I want to cover the people who support him fairly, because I think that we are heading down this dangerous road of grievance-based identity politics. And we can almost see this pattern throughout history. Yet the way out of this is not to demonize people. It's not to just label them a Nazi and then try to ostracize them to a dark corner of society. That's tried with Nick, and that hasn't worked. So we need a different approach. We need to have honest conversations, and we need to be able to find ways to push back against people's wrong ideas while not trying to push people away, but trying to give them a bridge to come to a space where they can be reconciled with society and with truth and with peace and with God. And that's my heart. So I think that'll be my next episode. We'll be touching more on that, which is kind of like where Seth and Dave and Piers are going to go in the rest of this. And that's going to be another 45 minutes to an hour to talk about that. So that'll be next week's episode. Please make sure you subscribe, like this video, support the show if you want to. Go to biblicalanarchypodcast.com and click support this show. We are in the end of the year here in LCI, and we're going to be ramping up our end of the year fundraising for next year. And so the more you guys fundraise and support this show, the more that we can continue to do this and all the different projects we're doing at LCI. As I always conclude by saying, live at peace, live for Christ. Take care.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.